Hello again, Stories with Rosie. How you all doing? I hope you all been doing brilliant. Last time we were reading the BFG, so I'm going to continue reading a couple of chapters more from this. And don't forget, if you have any poems, any stories, any pictures you want to send in, I'd love to show them. It'll be brilliant. So send them in, email me, link and email is at the bottom. Okay, so the BFG by Roald Dahl. The Snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice. And she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk. And the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket, and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her. Then she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. See, the awful thing was Sophie knew exactly what was going on, and although she couldn't see it happening, she knew that a monster, or a giant, with an enormous long pale wrinkly face and dangerous eyes had plucked her from bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all four corners of it at once with his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head through the little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast, his black cloak was streaming out behind him, like the wings of a bird. That looks pretty scary to me. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across moonlit fields. The hedges divided the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode across them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's legs like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while, a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. This giant is running fast, she told herself, because he's hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for his breakfast. New chapter, the cave. The giant ran on and on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was travelling at such a speed that the landscape became blurred. The wings stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation that they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. The giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind was rushing against Sophie's face, and it became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched in the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed like hours. Then all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding once again on the earth. She poked her head out the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down and was now running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use describing a galloping giant. I mean, he leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into a valley, and then up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And soon he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth. The ground was flat and pale. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered about. The dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared, and now the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out from the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great craggy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, lying against the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as if it had been a football. And now, where the stone had been, there appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large, the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, still carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place so the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from the outside. Now that the entrance was hidden and been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away, and Sophie just sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. "Oh, he's getting ready to eat me," she told herself. "He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he'll boil me first. Or perhaps he'll have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan, sizzling with fat." A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black coat and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. And on his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, and with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, with a finger of ice, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. Okay, that's it for now. I will do some more chapters, but take care of yourself, sending so much love, and don't forget, if you have any short stories even to share, or poems or pictures, anything, I'd love to get them. So stay safe, be happy, keep smiling. So much love.